Episode number 198 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about some tests that you should consider getting and consider asking your doctor if you are experiencing fertility challenges. And this is good information to know because sometimes doctors won't give you the thorough tests that you need. So I'm going to go over really the basics, and you can get really in depth, obviously, with tests, but these are the basics that everybody should start with. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. So by now, if you guys are listening to this podcast and are going through fertility challenges yourself, you've probably heard of a lot of these tests, especially the day 3 testing. So day 3 testing will monitor a bunch of your fertility hormones or hormones that impact fertility and can also somewhat estimate your reserve. So a lot of reproductive endocrinologists will do a day 3 testing. And so this includes your blood labs, and it includes hormones such as FSH, AMH, TSH, LH, estradiol, among others. And this is a great baseline to have, but I do want to mention a couple of things. So it's a great baseline to have because you want to know where your body's at, what your hormone levels are. The FSH can let you know if your body or your ovaries are actually responding well to your brain's signals to ovulate. And the higher the FSH, it means that basically the ovaries are not responding, so the brain has to produce more FSH in order to get that response. So basically the FSH is the signal from the brain, and it's just going to keep going until the ovaries respond. So if it's higher, typically you'll get told that it's too high, and the reproductive endocrinologists have that as a gauge to let you know, regardless if you're doing it naturally or through IVF. What I do want to say is that these numbers can change, and I've seen them change a lot, and I've even seen them change twice in a day. So I had one patient who came in and she saw her reproductive endocrinologist and gynecologist on the same day. So she did 2 labs, 2 blood drawings, and she said that when she got back the results, and it was 2 different labs too, so that could have impacted the reading, but they were different. The numbers were different, I think by 2 points for the FSH, which is really remarkably surprising. But just keep in mind that things like that can happen, and it is a snapshot. So even if you're measuring your heart, which is consistent, or even your breathing throughout the day, just think about how things fluctuate in your body. So if you take a picture of it, it's going to change depending on when you're taking the picture. So those things do move back and forth. And I've seen people have, so AMH is another thing that they test for. AMH is more or less to get an idea of the reserve, or how many eggs you have, not a specific number, but somewhat of an estimate on how much reserve you have. And that can also go up and down, believe it or not. So it is something that can be fluid. And also the AMH, even if it's really, really low, a person can still get pregnant because it only takes 1 egg to fertilize. And that's 1 pregnancy, just to keep things in perspective. So it is important to do the day 3 testing. It's great to have a baseline, and then eventually you can retest after a couple of months because, like I said, if you do implement certain changes in your life and take certain supplements, take herbs, do acupuncture, other lifestyle measures, it can actually make a difference and can change. So a couple of things to keep in mind. So when you do the day 3 testing, Like I said, a lot of times the reproductive endocrinologists, they do focus on those numbers in order to know how to move forward or make suggestions for a woman who's trying to conceive. So they may suggest IVF. You don't necessarily have to do that. That is something that you should decide whether it's something that you want to do personally. And just because they're suggesting that and just because they're saying that that's your only option, that does not mean it's your only option. And I can tell you this, many of my patients actually have been told that they can't get pregnant on their own, and they have. So keep that in mind, get multiple opinions, and just go in with somewhat of a grain of salt. It is good information to have, but just keep in mind that they're trained from one perspective, and their perspective and what they're used to is really helping people get pregnant through IVF or IUI, but that's really most of what they do. So the more you do anything, you're going to look for those things and you're going to suggest those things because that becomes part of your language. So another thing to keep in mind or ask for is an HSG, which is a hysterosalpingogram. That's a mouthful. And that basically will check with fluid and dye. It'll check the fallopian tubes and the uterus through a series of x-rays. And they also do that sometimes with saline instead of dye on an ultrasound. So either way, it's going to check. The main thing with it is that it's going to check to make sure that everything's clear with the uterus and that the tubes are clear and there's no blockage. And that is really important to test because you may be going for many years and just have your lab work and everything looks fine, and then just spend so much of your time trying to conceive and then find out that there's a tube blockage, and that's just going to impact your ability to conceive because for obvious reasons, because you're not going to be able to fertilize. I mean, the sperm's not going to reach the eggs. So that's a really important test to do. Keep in mind, it's uncomfortable. A lot of people mention that it's very uncomfortable, and it's not the easiest test in the world, but it's also not the worst test in the world either. Something else to keep in mind, which may, if you see that the tubes are blocked, and you may want to talk about possible endometriosis as a cause, because you really want to get to the bottom of why the tubes are blocked. So endometriosis is a condition where the uterine tissue starts to grow outside of the uterus, and it can cause blockages. It can cause lots of menstrual cramps. That doesn't mean that if you have really bad menstrual cramps that it's endometriosis, but just keep in mind that the only way to confirm endometriosis is through getting a procedure. It's not too invasive, but it is surgery, and it's called a laparoscopy. And I've heard so many people tell me, a lot of my patients come in and say that their doctor told them that they had endometriosis. And when I asked them if they had a laparoscopy, they said no, based on my symptoms, or I believe even an ultrasound. They said that they thought they had that, but they cannot confirm if that's what they really have unless they do a laparoscopy. Like the only way to confirm endometriosis is through this procedure. So there is no other way to confirm endometriosis. And if somebody or a doctor tells you that you have it without confirming, then it's an assumption. It's not a confirmed diagnosis. So that's something to keep in mind also for endometriosis. Now, I wouldn't suggest to have a laparoscopy in general. This isn't really one of my standard suggestions. This is something that you want to ask if you see that there's blockage or there's real potential that you have that. Generally speaking, what I do suggest really for everybody who's trying to conceive and is having challenges is the day 3 blood work, the HSG, and then a full thyroid panel is going to be the next thing. And that includes TSH, free T3, free T4, reverse T3, and thyroid antibodies. So a full thyroid panel includes all of those. And typically what a lot of doctors will test is just the TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone. That is basically a hormone that gets released by the pituitary. And typically speaking, it should be under 2. And the reason why I bring this up is because if it's up to 4, it's actually considered within the normal range. But for fertility specifically, it should be under 2. It should be functioning under 2. So even if it's like 2.5, if it's a doctor that knows what they're doing and understands fertility, they're going to suggest Synthroid or levothyroxine, which are thyroid medications. That the reason why it would be a little elevated after above 2 is because the thyroid's not functioning optimally in order to support pregnancy and fertility. And I'm actually all for taking thyroid medication if need be, because it really is a game changer if that's all you need. Sometimes that's all a person needs, and they can go through years of not being able to conceive just because the thyroid levels are not optimal. Keep in mind that the full thyroid panel will allow you insight on whether the reason why your thyroid is not functioning optimally may be because of thyroid antibodies. Basically, that shows that your body is attacking your thyroid. Your immune system is attacking your thyroid as if it's a foreign entity. And that's not great. And there's many different changes and supplements and diet protocols that you can actually implement to help. And many practitioners have written books about it and really have gone through it themselves and put themselves in remission. So it is something that can be done. I know gluten and soy and corn, those are food ingredients that can actually make it worse. So just removing that by itself or going on an autoimmune paleo diet can help. And another thing that you may want to ask for is just really to prove that you are ovulating is getting a progesterone test on day 21. So these are all things that you can really get at the doctor's office. And there are so many more tests that you can get with functional medicine doctors, with myself. You could do a Dutch test. I mean, there's so many different things that you can do as a supplement to this, but this as a base, when you're first trying to conceive and you're seeing that you're going through some challenges, this is really, really important to do, just so you have a base of tests to test for the big stuff, the big check marks. And you may also want to test for progesterone on day 21, because if the progesterone is at a high enough level, that will prove that you've ovulated. Many people are given a suggestion to do LH sticks or ovulation predictor kits. I've talked about this in previous episode. The problem with that is that all it does is it tests basically the LH that is being secreted from your pituitary in your brain. All it's saying is that your brain's trying to make your body ovulate, and it does not confirm that your body actually ovulated. So that's another test you want to do. And that could be day 21, day 19 to 21. And if it shows that your progesterone is elevated to a proper amount, then it proves that you ovulated. It can also show that you did ovulate, but your progesterone is very low. And you could possibly supplement with, this can actually help you figure out if you need to supplement with bioidentical progesterone or progesterone from the doctor to help you conceive and to help you keep the baby. So that's a really important thing to look into. And alternatives that you can do instead of doing that, just for this specific test, is you can actually do some testing at home. So as I mentioned, doing the LH, that only tests for basically your brain trying to get your body to ovulate. But what can confirm that you did ovulate is getting a test like Prove. So Prove will test for both the LH and it'll also test for the progesterone metabolites. And UVA does as well. And those two, at least as far as progesterone, they can test it. And that's another way to confirm that you have ovulated and that your progesterone is at a good amount that will support conception. You also want to test your vitamin D levels, which you can do with the doctor. You can mention that to them, but do mention that to them because it is really important. Vitamin D deficiency is linked with frequent miscarriages. It's linked with PCOS conditions, and it's also linked with unexplained infertility. So it really is an important thing to have to make sure that you're at a good level. And if it is low, start supplementing. Also include magnesium. It actually helps absorption of vitamin D. And test again. So if you already know it's low and you needed to test, treat it, give yourself like a month or two, and then come back and get it tested again just to make sure that what you're doing is helping. And of course, if you can get sunlight, but just avoid midday sun and try to get earlier morning sun because it's a safer time. Now, lastly, let's not forget about the males, the sperm. So a lot of times women will get checked. I've had patients go to really reputable reproductive endocrinologists and they do not ask about the men, and they should always ask about the men because they are part of the whole factor. It could be either the woman or the man or both. So it's important to test everybody. And typically what they'll do with men is they'll do a basic semen analysis, which includes a sperm count, volume. They look at motility, which is how they move, and morphology, which is how they are formed, because sometimes they can be deformed and that actually makes it harder for them to fertilize. So they look at that. Now, there's definitely deformed sperm typically, but there's a certain percentage that they look for just to make sure that it's not a huge percent. And then you can go from there at least as to what you can do. And then if it is low, they might look at other things like a varicocele or other factors that can contribute to low sperm count. But definitely do the low sperm count. Now, if you find that you're trying and you're doing IVF and all your numbers are great, all the males' numbers are great, one other thing that you could do, or frequent miscarriages, you might want to look at the sperm DNA fragmentation. This is something you have to really go out of your way to ask, and sometimes you will get pushback and resistance to doing that. That's something that you might want to look into. And if you do get frequent miscarriages as a woman, you might want to also look at the MTHFR gene mutation. So that is just another thing to mention. So those are the tests, the main tests. And of course, there are so many other things that you can test for. You can start getting into details like your gut testing, your Dutch testing. You can do a test on food sensitivities. You know, those are the intricacies. If you know that everything else is fine and you're finding that you're given the unexplained infertility diagnosis, that's when you want to start digging more deep. If you want to look into like, what is it? Because there is no such thing as unexplained. There's always a reason for why things are happening, but it's just a matter of looking into the fine little details to really nailing it and looking into what is it that the body needs. It could be like a food sensitivity, something that's irritating the body. Literally just finding those things and changing them can be a game changer. But those are the main things. This is where to start, and this is what you ask for. And keep in mind that sometimes doctors will not do the full thyroid panel. This is why I mention it, because sometimes they don't do that, and sometimes the gynecologist may not even bring up the fact that the TSH should be 2 or below. They may think it's normal if it's a little higher. When you go to reproductive endocrinologists, they do this all the time, specifically for fertility. So that would be your best bet, even if you're not going to go for IVF, to go and ask and just get the test done by a reproductive endocrinologist because they know what to look for. But just keep in mind that they're going to mention IVF. Get a couple of different opinions. Don't let that be like your thing, or don't go in order to get sold on IVF. Go in order to figure out what's going on to get the baseline. So I hope that helps. I think it's really important just to know and keep those things in mind, because then you know what to ask for, and then you know if you're not really getting what you need. And sometimes you will get pushback and they might say, oh, I don't think that you need a full thyroid panel, or I don't think you need X, Y, and Z. If you feel in your gut, you know what, I really want to know, and it's something that I really want to figure out, absolutely stand your ground. And if they're going to push back, then go to another doctor and get what you need or what you feel like you want to uncover, because it's really important not to waste your time. I mean, so many people go through so much time that passes by and they feel like they're wasting time, literally. And the last thing you need to do when you're on the fertility journey is to waste your time. So I'm all about try to figure out and uncover as much as you can. Try to check all the boxes, do all the tests. And a lot of these are covered by insurance, so that's a big plus. You might as well do that, because then you know at least what you're working with. And then if you find that you're given the unexplained infertility diagnosis, that's when you may want to go and start talking to a functional medicine practitioner or a fertility health coach that can run those tests. I also do that as well. I do run gut testing and Dutch testing, and those are the more intricate tests that go into a little bit more detail. So I hope that helped, and I hope this gives you a little more empowerment, a little bit more information so that you can advocate for yourself when you go to the doctor. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and have a beautiful day. So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.